Welcome, everyone, to the January 20th, 2024 meeting of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, 100% volunteer run, founded in the mid-90s with about 115 current members. We welcome new members interested in humanism and anyone interested in contributing their talents to our organization. Dues and donations are welcome and can be paid via PayPal, and I have the QR code shown there. Our speaker today is Dr. Sikivu Hutchinson. She is an educator based in Los Angeles. She's also an accomplished author, a playwright, and a musician. She is a recipient of the 2020 Harvard Humanist of the Year Award. Several of her books are shown here. Humanists in the Hood, Unapologetically Black, Feminist, and Heretical, which was published in 2020. Moral Combat, Black Atheists, Gender Politics and the Value Wars, published in 2011. The Roar of Distant Engines, a short story collection, published last year in 2023. And White Knight's Black Paradise, published in 2015, on the People's Temple in the 1978 Jonestown massacre. That last work I mentioned, White Knight's Black Paradise, is both a book and a sold-out play recently produced at the Blue Door Theater in Culver City. A group of us from HSSB attended the production and learned so much more about the history and the good social, racial, and economic justice intentions of the People's Temple. The play provided for me context and details so much richer than the quote-unquote drink the Kool-Aid type of headline typically associated with Jonestown. She's also the founder of Black Skeptics Los Angeles and the Women's Leadership Project, which is a Black feminist mentoring program for girls of color in South LA. Sikivu has also produced 4 original folk rock country genre singles as a guitarist, singer, songwriter. And if you like what she's doing and support her work, I invite you to buy her books and contribute to Black Skeptics Los Angeles or the Women's Leadership Project. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Sikivu Hutchinson and her talk, Gen Z Humanists in the Hood. Welcome, Dr. Hutchinson.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate the opportunity. So back in the day when terrestrial radio was king, a drive from west to east on LA's 10 freeway could be tamed by the dulcet tones of Ron Isley schooling us on bringing a, quote, harvest to the world, or the intergalactically strange Betty Davis running down the names of Black blues rock badasses in her trademark rasp, or the mad as a March Hare wizardry of keyboardist Bernie Worrell plinking out P-Funk aqua boogies. In the mid to late 70s of my elementary hood, Black homeowners forged tight-knit communities in suburbs. White folks had fled in terror decades before. Union jobs and defined benefit plans gave Black folks some semblance of generational wealth and security, and mass homelessness, incarceration, and prison pipelining had not yet become a permanent blight on Black life. This is kind of, sort of, not to wax nostalgic about some idyllic Black Arcadia of yore, but rather to spotlight the importance of the hood part of Black humanism and how place has always shaped the way we make meaning in the godless stone cold here and now. And that's a subtitle of the first chapter of Humanists in the Hood. As a baby atheist growing up in South LA, I never quite saw the totality of my lived experiences reflected in the community, but Black humanism and its emphasis on the importance of the material conditions of our everyday lives for meaning making, liberation, mental health, and social justice was in every sight, sound, and smell. From the neighborhood parks vibrating with Black swimmers and tennis players and girls slamming handballs in fierce competition, to the all-Black interscholastic youth bands that we played disco, jazz, and classical in. As Black folks are increasingly pushed out of their homes by gentrification, the fallout from the housing and mortgage bust, deflated wages and unemployment, so-called Black America has become more hyper-segregated. And this is one of the primary yet unacknowledged contexts for shifting secular perspectives among Black Gen Z youth. According to Christianity Today, over the past decade, quote, the share of African Americans who say that they have no religious affiliation has risen more dramatically than whites, Latinx, or Asian folks. 34% of Blacks identify as so-called nuns, but as of 2020, only 2% to 6% identify as agnostic, and the same percentage identify as atheists. Among that group, 53% of Black women and 51% of Black men identify as irreligious. And the important caveat here is that, quote, while the nuns have gained the most ground among African Americans, that does not mean that there are many more Black atheists and agnostics than there were in 2008. And these trends have gotten greater traction among young folks in their teens and 20s who are now the most heretical generation in US history. Social and gender justice issues are really the primary reason why some young African Americans are kicking church traditions to the curb and forging their own paths. Higher levels of gender fluidity and queer identification, coupled with lower levels of tolerance for theocratic bullshit, religious conservatism, and flat-out hypocrisy, as well as white Christian fascism and Christian nationalism, are driving this generational shift. My college students also speak of how the easy availability of internet material that challenges religious dogma is a major influence. And Gen Z's 2022 midterm rebuke of the GOP's ultra-conservative agenda on abortion rights, climate change, and voting rights policies was, for many, a clear example of the more liberal, progressive / secularized orientation of some, emphasis on some, young voters. In the final chapter of my 2020 book, Humanists in the Hood, which is edited by Dr. Anthony Penn, I discussed the rise of irreligion among youth of color and queer youth and young adults. Although greater numbers of BIPOC youth are openly questioning and rejecting organized religion, mainstream media are still fixated on whiteness and Eurocentric assumptions about who irreligious folks are and where / how they hold space. In 2020 and 21, I organized 2 Black secular youth forums, one in partnership with the American Humanist Association and the now defunct Black Humanist Alliance, which sought to challenge these notions. And the session featured Black atheist, freethinker, and humanist youth who were recipients of Black Skeptics First in the Family Humanist College scholarships. And we're going to see some excerpts from them at the end of the talk. Since 2013, BSLA has provided $2,500 to $5,000 scholarships to first-generation secular youth of color with an emphasis on LGBTQI+, foster care, unhoused, undocumented, disabled, and system-involved youth. And we were the first and are still the only Black secular organization to implement such an initiative. And with the support of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and other community partners, we are now able to provide multi-year scholarships to some of our awardees to ensure that they graduate from college. The impetus for the scholarship was twofold. As some folks may be aware, first-generation Black students often struggle to gain admission to college and stay in college due to lack of institutional support and resources, as well as systemic anti-Black racism and prison pipelining. Nationwide, Black youth are less likely to have access to college prep and college readiness resources. They are also more likely to be targeted for zero-tolerance discipline, leading to high rates of suspension, expulsion, and push-out. And although Black boys and Indigenous boys have the highest rates of suspension and expulsion among all youth, Black girls are 6 times more likely than non-Black girls to be suspended from school and also have some of the highest rates of in-school sexual harassment and victimization and sexual violence. In addition, Black queer youth and youth with disabilities also have disproportionate rates of suspension and expulsion. And it's important to note that Black youth are more likely to identify as queer than are non-Black youth. And this is according to some surveys that have been done by the National Black Justice Center and the Center for American Progress. Gen Z in general are also the most LGBTQ plus identified generation in history relative to millennials, Gen Xers, and of course, baby boomers. Last year, I surveyed approximately 40 Black youth between the ages of 15 to 24 about their views on Black humanism, media representations of Black and women of color atheists, respectability politics, and the connection between religion, misogynoir, which is anti-Black misogyny, and homophobia. The majority of them were from South LA, and I followed up with a podcast featuring 4 of my WLP or Women's Leadership Project mentees who range in age from 15 to 21. The WOP is a Black feminist humanist civic engagement, mentoring, and advocacy program for Black girls, girls of color, and queer youth, which is based in South LA. And much of our school-based programming focuses on in-class sexual and domestic violence, peer prevention education, and creating safe spaces for LGBTQ plus youth. We also do community rallies, engage youth with city and county policymakers, host quarterly LGBTQ plus youth institutes, provide paid internships, job opportunities, sponsor youth podcasts, and sponsor annual humanist scholarships named after Lorraine Hansberry, who was, of course, a noted Black radical freethinker and playwright. Last year, Black skeptics in WOP received funding from the Ujima community, which is the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community, for our sexual and domestic violence prevention education outreach. So during the podcast discussion with youth across the spectrum, Bev, then a 10th grader who identified as atheist, expressed anxiety about repeatedly being told that she was, quote, going to hell by a male student at her high school. And these views were echoed by a teacher who, upon finding out she was an atheist, retorted, "You still have morals, right?" The harassment led Beverly to keep her views and identity to herself. And on school campuses, scorn and stigma prevent young Black female non-believers, agnostics, and skeptics from speaking up about their views or questioning faith-based assumptions, equating religion and God belief with morality. And the constant threat of being adultified, and that's a term that refers to Black girls being perceived and treated as older than their actual years, adultified and hypersexualized, also deters Black girls from espousing straight-up atheism. The mainstream marginalization of humanist principles and values is another deterrent to espousing these alternative secular views. Reinforcing this point, the youth who responded to the survey almost unanimously reported that they'd seen little to no images of women of color atheists or secularists in the media or any other form of representation. 50% said that the prevailing image/stereotype of Black atheists was that they were immoral. 25% said the values of Black atheists were portrayed as being markedly, quote, different than that of religious folks. And the majority felt that there was more social and cultural pressure on Black women to be religious. And over 90% believed that greater numbers of youth were rejecting organized religion because of sexist, homophobic, and transphobic practices. In addition, few knew what humanism was or had even heard of it. And by the same token, some associated atheism again with immorality and deviance. This viewpoint was amplified by the African-American students in my African-American humanism course at Pitzer College, which I'm currently teaching a third iteration of. The syllabus features Black feminist and womanist authors, thinkers, and artists such as Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, Zora Neale Hurston, Elizabeth Acevedo, Brittany Cooper, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Octavia Butler, Betty Davis, Susan Laurie Parks, and the Combahee River Collective. And Pitzer is a a predominantly white institution on the eastern flank of LA County, which is part of the Claremont Colleges system. And it has the only secular studies program in the nation headed by secular scholar and author Phil Zuckerman. Discussing how she discovered African-American humanism for the first time in her final paper, my student Corey Waters noted, African-American humanism is an important concept for Gen Z to be familiarized with. Many issues can be viewed and taught from a secular perspective using concrete, real-world examples. Often Gen Z asks, why should we care, especially when we are constantly bombarded with new information? Gen Z is a generation that values social justice and equality in a manner unlike any previous generations, her humble perspective, which aligns with humanism. Gen Z can be presented with humanistic ways to engage, such as volunteering, donating to causes, and participating in social justice movements that address issues such as police brutality, systemic racism, discrimination in healthcare, and expanding access to safe sex awareness, all of which disproportionately affect Black women and intersect with humanism. What will really gain the attention of Gen Z is having young humanist figures to look to and learn from. Building from the foundation set by secular humanist figures and their achievements, such as Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin, can set a pathway for future Black secular humanists. On the other hand, Black humanists do not have to be larger than life, quote, historical figures such as the two writers. There should be an emphasis on finding humanism in the everyday, in the small moments. Black humanists are our teachers, neighbors, family, and the guy at the deli. I love that parting salvo from her. And so another student wrote, quote, my irreligiosity has grown even more salient this past semester, largely due to me finding new depths of my beliefs and lack thereof regarding religion, faith, and social institutions. I've discovered that my denial of institutional religious belief falls within a long and storied history of Black radical thought, culturally relevant activism, and advocacy for those suffering under the boot heel of interlocking systems of domination. Beyond all of that, though, I have found that there is a large and ever-growing community of Black secular scholars who are dedicated to unraveling the miseducations provided to so many like myself. I've never felt more honest, more challenged, more encouraged to voice myself in a classroom before, which is part of why I talk so much during discussions. And again, this is within the context of a PWI where African-American students are already marginalized and already lacking institutional support from the administration. And so all of these youth emphasize that if humanism is to have any relevance to Black youth, it must be grounded in their realities, especially as it pertains to prevention, activism, and mental health. For example, a new, in my view, devastating CDC report documenting the alarming mental health crisis among 9th through 12th grade girls and queer youth also highlights the lack of accessible, humanist, culturally responsive, anti-racist, and anti-sexist therapeutic and violence prevention resources that are available to youth. The CDC concluded that, quote, of every 10 teen girls that you know, at least one of them, possibly more, have been raped. And so not surprisingly, we're also seeing that almost 60% of teen girls had depressive symptoms in the past year. The report confirms that these high levels reported within the last decade, where 1 in 3 girls has seriously considered attempting suicide, is up by 60%. And among teens who identify as LGBTQ+, more than half reported experiencing poor mental health, while 1 in 5 had actually attempted suicide in the past year. From 2003 to 2019, suicide among Black girls increased by 59%. And the biggest increase occurred among 12 to 14-year-old girls who are, of course, in middle and high school. According to the Black Women's Blueprint, by the time they have turned 18, approximately 60% of Black girls have experienced some form of sexual abuse or sexual violence. And elaborating on this theme and connecting it to humanism, one of my freshman students last semester wrote that, quote, as a young Black girl growing up in rural Minnesota, my experiences differed from most of my classmates, but the policing and attempted control of my body was the most obvious thing. And this harkens back to my comment about the pervasiveness of adultification amongst Black girls. She continues, I started being dress coded at my public school at the age of 7 and continued to be written up and punished for it until I graduated. She makes a connection between this form of policing and Christian respectability, stating that the Black humanist emphasis on bodily autonomy as a way to disrupt the male gaze and the white colonial gaze has resonated with her. Surging rates of depression, suicidal ideation, and suicide among Black girls and Black queer youth are also precipitated by toxic anti-Black, misogynist, homophobic, and transphobic school climates that silence and victim shame female identifying and queer youth violence survivors. Youth leadership, therapy, arts-based, and community building opportunities, all of which we deploy in the Women's Leadership Project, can provide coping resources for and safe havens from unrelenting violence Black youth experience in their everyday lives. And so as a result of these horrendous stats, in 2021, WOP created the hashtag Standing for Black Girls Wellness Initiative to provide free culturally responsive humanist therapy to Black girls, queer youth, and youth of color survivors of sexual and domestic violence by connecting them with BIPOC and queer affirming mental health practitioners, and again, with an emphasis on secular, non-judgmental care. The connection between culturally responsive violence prevention and humanistic alternatives of care is clear. In neighborhoods where churches may provide the only physically safe after-school / extracurricular spaces for Black and Brown youth, access to non-faith-based resources is imperative. The next slide is of a recent Standing for Black Girls Coalition press conference that we held this summer, where we called on the city of LA, specifically our African-American mayor, to redress the increase in domestic and sexual violence against Black women and girls by opening funding for targeted prevention education, mental health, and safe spaces. And so during our final session in last semester's African-American humanism class, we discussed the unique role that art plays in Black humanist healing, mental health, and liberation. And students presented on Black humanist music, identifying artists as diverse as Lenny Kravitz, Kendrick Lamar, Nas, No Name, Queen Latifah, Little Sims, Jimi Hendrix, Nina Simone, Stevie Wonder, Fishbone, and others for a Black humanist playlist. These artists' verbal, lyrical, and instrumental messages and stylings spoke to the students' desire for nonconformity in artistic expression. Musing on Black futures, one group created a moving Black humanist children's book blurb that spotlighted fifth graders from Black queer and humanist families navigating their different belief systems after attending a fundamentalist Christian church service. The youth disagree with the homophobic messages they hear at the service and reflect on how no one needs to have religion or a holy book in order to be moral or good. This emphasis on questioning, skepticism, and human-derived ethics, justice, and meaning-making through art is one of the most important for Black Gen Z secular youth, as they challenge the religious conservatism, homophobia, transphobia, and misogynoir within Black communities, as well as white nationalist attacks on bodily autonomy and reproductive health, racial justice, LGBTQ+ rights, African American studies, multicultural education, climate justice, mental health, and other issues. And so in conclusion, I'd like to show a few clips from some of the Black Gen Z secular students that I've had the privilege to work with. If we could roll the first clip.
I remember like last year when I was in 9th grade, I remember we were lining up for a health class or something like that from Miss Harris's, and then they were like talking about religious stuff, and then they were just asking people like, oh, what's your faith? And then when they came around to me and I said, oh, I'm an atheist, there was this one boy who was like, oh yeah, you're going to hell, da 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 da, like, you know, when you're gonna be in your casket, you know, God's gonna see you on Judgment Day, and you're just gonna burn in hell for your entirety. I'm just like, I'm like, what? And keep in mind, I literally just said I'm an atheist, and he was being so mean to me just because I was an atheist. Like every day he would see me in the hall, he's like, just remember you're gonna go to hell and stuff like that. Like, and then he randomly crept up on me in the hallways when I was with my friend, and he just started talking about the Bible and how like God is gonna hate me forever and stuff like that. And I was just like, whoa. I was like, okay. And he's like, you need to turn to God now before you just suffer. And I'm like, first of all, how is you threatening me gonna make me want to turn to your faith? Like, you get what I mean? Like, if you want someone to turn to your faith, don't you think you should approach them with kindness? I don't know, just a suggestion. Like, I don't think it's right to like threaten people with like, I don't know, just bad stuff. And if you want them to just be a part of your religion, like that doesn't make sense to me. I know it's biased because like, you know, I'm an atheist, but I mean, even then it's not right to do that. And even so, like, I would ask him, like, do you think what you did was right? He's like, yes, it's right. I'm just doing what God tells me to do. I'm being a good person. I'm just doing what I have to do and stuff. And when we were, like, asked for the medical questions, what would you do if your patient is non-religious, agnostic, or atheist, he was like, I wouldn't treat them because they're an atheist. And I was like, you're not suitable to be in the healthcare field. And I'm like, and I know there's people out there in real life who think like this, so it's really concerning, considering the fact that he's like a young boy, you know, so, and he still has that mindset to this day. Like, we're both in 10th grade now. I mean, he said he forgives me for being an atheist. I remember he said that to me. So he's not as openly vocal to me as like for hating me for being an atheist, But I'm like, why should you forgive me as if I owe you some sort of apology just for my lack of belief?
The first question is, how would you describe your secular humanist perspective, and do you feel it's generally understood or misunderstood? Who would like to answer that one? Kola.
Thank you. I don't know. I think my worldview, my perspective, or whatever, is a pretty straightforward one. It's pretty simple. I mean, I've always been very interested in causality and how things relate to other things. And I'm also very, very aware, because life continues to show me this, I'm extremely ignorant and I know very, very little. And those two things combined lead me to kind of taking a lot of these big questions, questions about afterlife and creation and all these different things. I just assume that I don't know enough to even start to approach them in a concrete sense. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm actually secular, is that I think it's very hard to come to particular conclusions about why we're here or what we're doing here or how we should live. So I take things in a very as they go sort of sense. I don't think it's something I'm going to figure out while I'm here, but I'm extremely happy that I'm here. And I'm always kind of thrown by what the universe kind of sends to me. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Who else would like to answer that? How would you describe your secular humanism? And do you feel it's generally understood? Kaylin.
My answer is actually a little similar to Cola's. I feel like my perspective is somewhat easily understood, especially like after a conversation or two. I respect religion and, like religious people. I believe that everyone should be able to, do what they want. And I have like a sort of respect to religion, especially after being raised in a Christian household. I can like appreciate religion for what it is. I feel like religion is kind of the result of humans attempting to like answer, unanswerable questions, like what are we doing here? Like what is our purpose? And I think that's kind of beautiful that rather than just, being okay with the unknown, we try to name things and or give things meaning. I think that's really beautiful. But I also know that a lot of religions kind of tend to veer away from focusing on, taking care of people and, centering people as my personal reason for why I've kind of distanced myself from religion. But I have found that when I've had conversations about my beliefs, especially with people who are religious, and I'm able to explain that, I don't think that religion is inherently a bad thing, but I think that it has been kind of perverted and misconstrued. I think that those conversations have usually gone well, and that my beliefs can kind of be easily understood, but after a conversation or two.
And what's interesting is, based off what you're saying, that when you approach the conversation a certain way, the reaction is a little bit different versus how people perceive non-religious atheists or agnostic people to be overly aggressive, like we're trying to get a rise out of people. And you're saying that you just explain, in a very respectful way that, hey, I can respect that, this is necessary for you maybe, but for me, this isn't part of the conversation. I actually have a different way of looking at life.
Hi, my name is Amir Sadi. Thank you so much to Black Skeptics LA for selecting me for the First in the Family Humanist Scholarship and campus organizations dedicated to helping Black students and queer and trans students of color succeed. I understand how important it is for Black students to support each other in the face of adversity. As a robotics engineering major at UC Santa Cruz, I plan to develop technology that combats racial and gender bias in machine learning networks. In my professional career, I want to create educational programs to support low-income Black and BIPOC students. By removing the barriers that stand between Black students and their postgraduate careers, we can better ensure that more diverse professionals are able to enter fields like STEM. Diverse professionals can better understand the potential areas of bias that their fields can perpetuate, and they can prevent them. I identify as a humanist because humanity alone has the power to create social change. I believe that humans are influenced by the conditions of our environment, but I also believe that we're capable of free will and spontaneity. By believing that all our choices are our own, that gives us the power to change the world around us. As an aspiring engineer, I know that every problem has a solution. If we make the conscious decision to change our environment, we can eliminate systems of oppression at their source to create a better world for everyone. Thank you so much.
According to the 2015 Religious Landscape Survey by the Pew Research Center, American millennials are less religious than previous generations. The number of Black millennials who identify as Christian is 20% less than the Boomer generation. Why do you think that is? Do you see that pattern continuing with Gen Z? Why or why not? So according to this survey and this study, they're finding that Black millennials are attending church less. Now, they're not necessarily becoming atheists, but they are leaving the church and they are leaving a lot of common religious spaces. Kola.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back a little bit to what I was saying before, that probably people are just trying to reassess how they relate to religion, because there have been a lot of drastic societal shifts and everything that I think have allowed people to see certain habits and ways of expressing religion as not mandatory anymore. So you kind of have a more flexible way of expressing however you associate yourself with your belief system, right? So I think that's happening a lot, which is probably showing why that trend is happening, where they're not, people are not attending church as much and stuff like that. I think that trend will continue with Zoomers and stuff like that, just because I think, again, people are just trying to kind of almost come to terms with what systems they want to uphold and maintain, and which they're okay with kind of like reinterpreting or setting to the side. I think you mentioned at one point in that question that whether or not it'll like completely fade out, because it's almost implied with that sort of trend that like it'll just continue to dwindle down or something like that.
Yeah, my question is, do you think that'll continue, that we'll see less and less attendance in churches and in common religious practices over time? Will we see that pattern continue, the decline of religion in Black communities?
I think it will decline, but I don't think it's going to peter out. And I also think that there's going to be a point where it's probably going to plateau. There's a lot of alarm around it because America, and because it's a very religious country. But I do think that a lot of this is just actually people just kind of reorienting how they express religion. And some people, and a lot of it also is people who are actually just saying, oh, I'm not religious anymore, which is going to happen, especially since, like I said, it's not a mandatory, it doesn't feel as foundational to people's lives and how they must live their lives as it once was. But I think that it will kind of be a thing of what we're seeing actually just people kind of reorienting themselves and also trying to figure out how they can bring their belief systems into practice with their daily, 21st century lives.
Yes, and that's interesting because that's pretty much what the data kind of says, that because they're not necessarily becoming atheist or even humanist, right? They're pretty much just leaving what we know now as common religious perspectives for Black families, which is mostly Christianity and some Islam. Kaylin.
I feel like as time passes, our generation is definitely becoming more progressive, and we're slowly moving away from the outdated constraints of religion. I also feel like a lot of us are kind of acknowledging the flaws and the bigotry that happens in religious spaces. And like you said, I don't think that people are moving away from Christianity or religion per se. I think they're just moving away from the church, because I've learned, and I feel like a lot of people are realizing now, that the two don't have to go together. The church is there's a lot going on there in the church, and a lot of people are realizing that even if they love God, even if they want to continue to worship, they don't have to do it around these people, and they don't have to subscribe to the exact beliefs that are being peddled in these places. And I think that a lot of people are maybe starting to analyze what's going on, and maybe trying to just basically dissecting what they're being taught now. I feel like people aren't just taking it anymore. They're kind of thinking, okay, where are these beliefs coming from? Where do they originate? Why is this what I'm being told to think? Why is this what I have to do? I think that also people are kind of like the way that we interact with religion personally is changing. For so long, religion has kind of been inflicted on others, and it's been shaped around how you feel about how someone else lives their life. But I think that now it's kind of changing to focus more on how, like, what your personal relationship with your God is, rather than how you feel about what other people are doing.
Yeah, so the youth that just spoke, again, they were recipients of the First in the Family Humanist Scholarship. And Kola is now in a PhD program at Stanford, and Kaylin is proceeding with her undergrad program. So if any folks have questions, we can proceed with those.
Thank you for that. Does anybody have questions for our speaker? Robert.
I noticed that one of your books was about transportation. I was just wondering if you could say something about that.
That's actually an adaptation of my PhD dissertation, and it was looking at public transportation in Los Angeles, specifically the streetcar system, the yellow cars and the red cars, the Pacific Electric Railway, and how it shaped the built landscape of LA, and specifically how it shaped urban communities and African American communities coming to Los Angeles during the Great Migration period.
When was the Great Migration period?
So that was the early 20th century into roughly the late 60s. And again, we're talking about the exodus of African Americans from the deep Jim Crow South into the so-called promised land of the North.
Thanks for those interviews. That was interesting hearing directly from the young people. I'm wondering many things, but one is, are there any good role models for them to look to?
So when you say good role models, do you mean Black secular humanist free-thinking role models, or just role models out in the world?
No, sorry, that was exactly what I meant. Black secular humanist role models. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, insofar as there are quasi-prominent Black freethinkers in the community. And then getting back to what Corey said in her paper, we are trying to amplify the degree to which humanism is not something that's primarily espoused by secular scholars or by luminaries. I mean, humanism can be embodied by quote unquote everyday, ordinary, working class folk going about their professions or going about community organizing, being artists, being educators. So that's where I place my emphasis in the class and trying to make the connections between culturally relevant humanism and their lived experiences as African American young people grappling with white supremacy and anti-Blackness and educational and things that have, again, very concrete impacts on their relationship or lack thereof to democratic traditions in the United States or to their local communities or to civic engagement.
No, I understand that there may be the guy at the deli who's a role model, but people may not know those people. I mean, so like this week, I went to a memorial for a friend of mine who was a leader in the community for social justice and education, and she was Black, and it was held in a church, and most of the memorial had this religious focus. And I've known her for decades, and I also know her husband for decades, and I don't ever remember talking religion to either of them. And I mean, they were humanists in the best sense. And yeah, when I'm in those situations, I'm sort of disoriented because it's like, it'd be great if there was a role model that people knew more widely that you could point to and say, why can't we have a service that's more like that? I mean, I can't come in and do that because I'm a old white guy, but somebody that they can relate to. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I tried to foreground the nuances of that in my response. So if you're asking why is there this paradox that your friend who you perceived as being a humanist, and I don't know if you're saying that that friend was a secular humanist or a spiritual humanist or religious, obviously there are different variations of being a humanist, but the reality is that if you're in the African American community, doesn't matter what your ideological or theological perspective is, you are going to have close proximity to religious and faith-based institutions. I mean, that's just part and parcel of our history in this nation. And it's also, this is a crux of Humanists in the Hood, is part and parcel of the brutal reality of hyper-segregation in this country. That if you go to Black communities across the income spectrum, across the socioeconomic spectrum, you're going to see a high concentration of storefront churches, of mid-sized churches, of mega churches, okay? And we don't necessarily have the same presence of, say, nonprofit, secularized institutions that actually have real estate in our communities because of hyper-segregation, because of institutional racism, the lack of lending for small Black businesses or small Black CBOs. So therein lies that disparity.
Yeah, Robert, I would make maybe a side comment. When my mother-in-law passed away, she was not a religious person. And yet the person who we asked to speak at her memorial service invoked all this religious stuff. And we were like, no, she wasn't like that. But it was kind of too late. So I think sometimes it's the people who are left behind who get to decide in many ways what kind of memorial service, where it's held, how it's done, and so on. That may be another aspect to this. Any other questions?
I'm just trying to understand how this is ever going to change, because if people just sort of feel rooted in their history and then they keep that going, then how do you get out of that? I mean, like, I'm rooted in my Jewish history, but I'm also happy to declare myself first and foremost a secular humanist. And I'm just wondering, how do you get there?
Yeah, again, emphasizing the provision of social services, the provision of prevention education, the provision of safe spaces for Black youth, queer youth, other vulnerable youth. Those are really the most concrete, specific mechanisms to redress this huge disparity that exists between those who might want to espouse a secular humanist perspective and those who are steeped in faith-based traditions. Faith-based traditions are going to offer, for example, very concretely, in my community, you're going to have a recreational space. You're going to have gym space in a church. You're going to have a food pantry that is being administered by the church. You're going to have sessions that provide you some degree of civic engagement or cultural solidarity. They are going to be housed within a church. We do not have anything comparable from a secular humanist orientation in the communities that folks of color live in. So that, unfortunately, is a brutal reality. That we can talk about an ideological shift, and a lot of the young folks were articulating that there's been an ideological shift, but that's not concretized vis-a-vis a mass embrace of secular humanism, or atheism, or free thinking. Folks don't know what that is because they don't see it operating concretely in terms of the delivery of social services in their communities. It's just, so that is going to be a continuing disconnect. Now, the hope is that as the young people express, you'll have more and more youth that are just questioning, okay, that are becoming skeptical, that may have some element of heretical leanings, okay, because they have greater access to the myriad information that we know exists on the internet and in social media and other virtual platforms. And so that will continue to reverberate in Gen Z and subsequent generations and demographics. But as far as a wholesale transition, it remains to be seen. What Humanists in the Hood emphasizes is that this shift is not going to occur as quickly as those of us who are humanists, those of us who are free thinkers would like to see, because of racial inequity, gender inequity, class inequity, all of the socioeconomic disparities that we see informing American society that, of course, are being ramped up and escalated by this draconian Christian fascist, white Christian nationalist, and hyper conservative, reactionary authoritarianism that's emerging from MAGA and Trump and all of the other bottom feeders and troglodytes.
In the conservative movement, little c, if the feeling is that services that are delivered should be delivered through religious institutions, that it's not the job of government, that it's not, that it should be the church, that it should be, that it is, and that is where doing good should come from, and then it's not the job of other non-secular institutions that have any support of the government to provide those services, and we're really fighting that now.
Absolutely. Yeah. That is a very insidious cancer. And that unfortunately is what undermines a lot of community-based organizations like the Women's Leadership Project, like Black Skeptics, from really becoming sustainable, because we're piecemealing it with small grants. We got a larger grant, fortunately, from Ujima, but that's going to go away. That's American Rescue Plan funding. And we know if Biden is not elected, there will not be anything comparable within the Trump regime. I mean, that's just a foregone conclusion. So it's like we're scrambling, we're hustling, we're having to piecemeal it within this context of capitalist exploitation, and capitalist disenfranchisement. So therein lies yet another problem if we're thinking about how can we truly institutionalize secular humanist systems of care.
We've got a question here from Christy. She says, do you find opposition to encouraging secular humanism from parents or families of the youth you work with, or are attitudes of the families shifting as well?
No, there's opposition. And it's part and parcel of what I identified, during the talk, that of course we have this broader context of white nationalism and white Christian fascism and this utter decimation of church-state separation. So you have that, but then you also have a very reactionary element amongst some African-American and Latinx families and communities with regard, obviously, to embracing secular perspectives and traditions and institutions. And there's also a lot of homophobia and transphobia and heteronormativity and heterosexism coming from those quarters. So it's really a perfect storm of marginalization and erasure when it comes to trying to normalize secular humanism, if you will.
All right.
I'll put our websites in the chat too, if folks want to learn more.
Yeah, please do. And again, anyone wanting to learn more about this topic, there are Sikivu's books that we mentioned, plus you can support her organizations, become more educated, get more involved, see what we can do to help. Thanks to all of you for attending. Thank you, Dr. Hutchinson, for spending this time with us, and hope to see you all at our next event.